So what's the point of this? I know a lot of people have become curious about Iran and that they're not very helped by media narratives. So the whole point of this deep dive is to help you make sense of Iran. Not really make sense of the news about Iran, but make sense of Iran itself, so that you can, when you hear the news, that you can sort out the facts. So who did what when. You will have the ability to predict what will happen next. It's quite satisfying, and with Iran it's actually quite easy. So hereby you're invited for a ride. A very different story about Iran that is based on primary sources and observations rather than fantasies and myth. So I've studied Iran for many years now, and one of the really big things that hit you when you start studying Iran is that there are a lot of beliefs around Iran, a lot of misconceptions, misunderstandings, misreadings. Some of them I think are very conscious, some of them are not. And I want to help you understand Iran not through the stories that you are served, but through explaining some of the empirical realities that forms the background and gives the context to the foreign policy of Iran, which was where I started, and its defense policy, which is what I had to look into to understand the foreign policy as well. So let's get started. So Iran, or the Islamic Republic of Iran, came into being in 1980 after a referendum. And it was the result of the first non-violent revolution, successful non-violent revolution in modern history. That revolution has a very long history. I'm not going to go into that today. What is important to discuss, though, is the context in which this revolution happened globally, and that particular historical time. So it was during so what we think of as the colonial times. Colonial times extends to 1994. So when you ask scholars who study colonialism, for instance, okay, historians, sociologists, political scientists, peace researchers, we will say that decolonization happened between 1948, beginning with India, and then extends until 1994, when South Africa reached a decolonial situation with a majority vote. And the Iranian Revolution happens in the second half of those decades, okay? So 1979. A lot of the inspiration for many of those who participated actively in making the revolution happen, and we're talking not just about the so-called clerical parts of Iranian society, we're talking also about the Marxists, socialists, liberals, were all inspired in different ways by decolonization as it happened in other parts of the world. So when this new state came into being, it defined itself as part of a much larger global decolonial tendency, a wish, acts of decolonization. If you listen through the UN speeches, the openings at the UN openings, decolonization is a central theme throughout all of them. Decolonization is a central theme also in Iran's constitution. The preamble is a marching cry for revolutionizing the world system. The demand or the wish or the cry is not for an Islamic revolution, but for a decolonizing revolution. This is often misunderstood. So the Iran that emerges out of the revolution is a defiant, non-colonial entity or anti-colonial entity, anti-imperialist entity, anti-hegemonic entity. You also will note, if you read through the Constitution, that a very, very central theme is independence, self-reliance. And this becomes even stronger after the revolution, as Iran was invaded by Iraq in 1980. Before then, this new state, the Islamic Republic of Iran, had actually decided to get rid of their weapons. I think this is the only example in the world that I know of where a state decides to disarm itself. They actually put weapons out for sale. So Iran started out as a state that wanted not only to decolonize and to be considered equal among equals, it also started out disarming. So for peace to be possible, the idea was you can't have weapons. So that is a massive difference to the situation we see today. And the cause for that change was the Iraqi invasion and the almost a decade of war with Iraq, during which Iran had to deal with what they had left in the hangars and around the country. So Iran comes about at a very revolutionary moment in world history. It has very clear connections to other revolutionary decolonizing projects around the globe. Iran still has very strong ties to Latin America. There's a reason for that. They've had strong ties with Latin America for a long time, so since the revolution. They have had strong ties with anti-colonial or anti-imperialistic states such as North Korea since 1979-80. They have had strong ties with Southern Africa for a long time, because Southern Africa was also involved in a decolonizing struggle, both Zimbabwe and South Africa. So we need to remember that that is the context in which Iran grows out of, develops from. Okay, so let's have a look now at the foreign policy. So the foreign policy, there's some stipulations in the Constitution that I think are absolutely essential to actually understand what Iran is about when it comes to foreign policy. One of those is, as I said just before, so independence, sovereignty. So the states ability to make decisions on its own based on its population's needs is central. The economic policy that is put out, that is the structure of an economic policy that is laid out in the Constitution is actually important. So why do I say that? Because foreign policy, economic policy, defense policy actually ties in with each other quite strongly in the case of Iran. The idea is that you have to be able to sustain your own population and to fill the needs of that population. We're talking material needs here, right? Mainly, okay? Through your economic policy. So development policy is really important in Iran, okay? So the ability to develop the economy. Now, this is one thing that a lot of people don't know, okay? So Iran have scored extremely badly in what we call the Gini coefficient. So the Gini coefficient shows how wealth is, how broadly wealth is spread in the population. And Iran was doing very badly on that in 1979. So still not good, but a lot better than they did in 79. And this despite all of the sanctions that Iran has been subjected to for almost the 40 years, 40 of the almost 50 years that it has been in existence. So the wealth distribution in Iran, so that means basically what the Gini coefficient shows you is not just income, okay? How that develops in a country. So the economic situation for the population as a whole is much better today than it was in 1979. The health system is very good, and the systems for helping people, poor people, is much better today than it was before. Access to education is much better today. They have, when you look at tertiary education, so university level, you have basically 50-50, a little bit more women at university than men. So it's very similar to the Scandinavian countries, actually. So all of these things are about economic policy, and for Iran, this is really important because the building blocks of Iran is the population, right? So and this is explicitly expressed throughout these almost 50 years, that the population is the central aspect of wealth for Iran, and the main orientation has been always to lift the population, the poorest of the poor and the poor, to try and create a situation which will lift them. Okay, so this is domestic policy. It's not my big thing, but it's very important to understand that this is what is stipulated in the Constitution, because that lines up with how foreign policy is also conducted. So foreign policy then is tied in with economic policy, and the economic policy has been, so the aims, the objectives of the economic policy that Iran has stipulated in the Constitution has been hampered quite a lot by all the sanctions. This is also the aim of the sanctions, is to pull the rug under the republic by making life difficult for the regular population. As a peace researcher, I define this as direct violence. I base myself on Johan Galtung, when I say this. So when you organize sanctions against a population with the aim of starving the population or hindering it from accessing health materials, medicines, um, um, machinery, whatever that you need to grow your food, to heal your sick, and to develop an industry, that is counted in peace research and peace theory as direct violence. In principle, it's no different than actually doing real war on the country. So for most of the almost 50 years that the Republic has been in existence, it's also been very hard hit with sanctions that aimed at starving out the population so that the population would rise up and regime change the state. So because of this, the economic policy is being defined over the years more and more as security policy. And despite the sanctions, Iran has done pretty well. It's got some good friends over the years that has helped out, but it needs sanctions lifted to really do the leap that it needs to do. So that was a bit about the economic policy that I think it's important that you know about. So sanctions busting is part of Iran's security posture. You can access almost anything in Iran. It's a bit matter of money, of course, but all the goods that you can buy in European cities, US cities, in India or in China, Western stuff, you can also buy in Iran. There are also a lot of goods from China, from Turkey, from Russia, from India, from Thailand, from different places. But you do have quite a lot of Western goods being sold, and it's not illegal. Okay, so there is a security aspect to political economy, the political economy in Iran. Now, let's move into the foreign policy. So, Iran's foreign policy is based on the idea that Iran and Iranians are as valued and as important as anyone else on the globe. That Iran as a state, of course, has the same weight as any other state in the world. In Iranian discourses about world policy, world politics, global politics, Iran is always thought of, defined as important as anyone. Now, other countries in Iranian discourse is also defined as important as anyone. At the same time, we all know that the US is quite important and in many ways actually a bit more heavyweight than Iran. So that's not really what this is about. It's not a self-delusion, okay? This is an ideological stance. So when Iran refuses to bow to the UK, France, the EU, the USA, it's because why should they decide what's going to happen in Iran? Iran doesn't go about telling the UK what to do. Wouldn't dream of it, right? So why does the UK feel that they have a say in what policies Iran decides to have. What Iran does and the policies that Iran chooses to run by should be decided by the Iranian population. And in great measure, it is decided by the Iranian population. This is another misconception, okay? That everything is decided somewhere high up among some Ayatollah sort of group of people. That is not the case. We're coming to defense policy, and I'll just put in here a little note. Since June, the spiritual leader of Iran has decided to take over foreign policy and in particular defense policy because they are in war. And the policy needs to be decided or discussed and directions decided upon in a particular council. So you have a new council that has been established, which is directly under Khamenei. It consists of clerics, but also regular politicians, and other experts, okay? So, and a military top rank, okay? So it's not a sort of where you have, it's just the mullahs deciding everything. That is not the case with Iran. Okay? So foreign policy is very, it's the same across, basically the same, across the different presidencies. And the reason for that is because it's laid down in the constitution. So you don't depart from the constitution. In small bits and cases here and there, it's tweaked according to sort of the ideas of the sitting president. But basically, Iranian foreign policy is very stable. It doesn't change much. Because the orientation is independence, it's the very explicit work against colonialism. It's based in the idea of equality and international law. So these makes the frames for the foreign policy. Iranian foreign policy is focused very much on international law. So the way that we, through the UN system, has decided as a global community to handle relations between states. So Iran has always been, as an Islamic republic, has always been very much engaged in different fora in the UN, where, let's say, discussing weapons of mass destruction and the limitations of those and things like that. Iran will go by international law in all its agreements. So if you make an agreement with Iran, they are very tough negotiators. They have to, according to the constitution, to abide by the limitations and possibilities set out by Islam. Okay, so Islam is important in everything that Iran does as a state on foreign policy. If you return back to economic policy, this is also based in fundamental Islamic principles that everyone must have access to their basic needs. So an Islamic principle is that everyone must have their needs covered: water, food, shelter, education. Education is a fundamental right. Um, so again, if you look at foreign policy, uh, you need to make sure that the foreign policy is in line with Islamic fundamentals. And that is, among other things, that you go by the laws that are implemented internationally. So foreign policy is, of course, then based in a legalistic view on relations between states, but importantly, foreign policy also aims, from an Iranian perspective, towards cooperation. So you have to use your foreign policy as the arena where you avoid war, where you handle conflicts of interest, where you define how you will relate to your neighbors, for instance. So this is also something that very few people know. But in 1982, during the first sort of years of the war with Iraq, so after the Iraqi invasion, Iran engaged in what we call shuttle diplomacy. So they would go around to all the states in the Persian Gulf area, the region, and try to establish diplomatic relations for discussing security in the region. Not from a strictly Iranian interests perspective, but from the perspective that we can't go on having these kind of militarized relations where actors from outside the region come in, convene on the region and decide who's going to go to war against whom. So that was the Iranian reading of it. This has been one of the mainstays of Iranian foreign policy since then. It's been to try and establish a regional security architecture that is managed by, that is controlled by the region. Which will make the region's states, the states themselves, but also the region, independent, militarily speaking, security-wise, of other actors. And from an Iranian perspective, we talk about all other actors. So it's not just the US, right? There are big discussions in Iran concerning Russia or concerning China. Many people are very critical of letting those two states in. This is another aspect that ties in foreign policy with security and defense policy, because Iran will not, many Iranian at least, will not consider necessarily China or Russia as particularly better than the United States. They might not have domineering interests at the moment, but they might develop them over time. So there is a huge critical or debate critical of all big countries, so countries that are huge. So the Iranian approach here is to say, okay, if we can get this region, we, as in all the countries in West Asia, together as one group, then, and creating our own security through our own means, then we don't have to rely on weapons systems from outside or from strategic or on strategic interests that are not our own. Okay. Importantly to note here is also that Iran does not define the interest of such a security architecture as being hegemonic in orientation. So Iran works against hegemonies. They're not interested in hegemony. They've had hegemony in the region across the span of the last 4,000 years, 3,500 years. They've tried that. They're not interested. Okay. What they seek is cooperation between the states in that region and to establish the region as independent and as a negotiator with bigger entities such as Russia, such as China, such as the United States, such as the EU. So in foreign policy terms, Iran is focused on building relationships, particularly in the region. But they're also, and this is also something that many people seem to not really understand or know, Iran builds relationships far beyond the region. So you've had relationships with, as I said before, economically, but also ideologically, not then in terms of Islam or in terms of religion, but in terms of decolonization. Okay, so there's been a long history with ties with other states that work for the same. So Iran is building relationships much more than building alliances. Alliances are hierarchical structures. Iran is not interested in hierarchies. Iran is interested in cooperation between equals. And we're going to shift now slowly into defense, because there's one area where we have an overlap, and that is what has been called the axis of resistance. So the axis of resistance is sort of stretches from Hezbollah in Lebanon over Shia groups or militias in and actually quite a lot of the politicians and the states in Iraq after Saddam Hussein and Iran, and then including also, so it's a half moon kind of thing, with Yemen. So what these groups share is the idea of independence from imperialist states, decolonization. So this is the basic common interest that we're seeing. And these groups will help each other. It's not just a matter of Iran feeding these groups. Hezbollah has been relatively independent and even been helping Iran in later years. Yemen is full of weapons since the Cold War, and you do have quite some very good engineers that have been involved in developing the weapons that were already there. Iran has been involved in smuggling in some stuff. It's a trade between. Actually, it is a trade between Yemen and Iran. It's defined as illegal by the Western states and by UAE and Saudi. But there's nothing illegal in terms of Iranian or Yemeni law in the material support. Iran does not operate proxies. Okay, so these different groups are not proxies of Iran. A proxy is a group that does the work for another actor. These groups don't do anything for Iran. They do stuff for themselves, okay? But they share a goal among them. And that goal is independence from Western influence, any kind of Western influence. There is no idea of going to war against the West, really. It's a matter of having the West leave the region so that the region can heal and decolonize on its own terms. So this is what is the idea that is shared between these groups. Sometimes they seem to coordinate actions, but for most of the time they seem actually to be doing their own actions in their own context for their own reasons. So the idea that there is sort of a hierarchical alliance structure between these entities and groups is incorrect. So this is sort of the overlap. So the into the defense policy that Iran has. Now the problem with Iran, as a researcher for me, then, is to be, how do you go about figuring out what the defense policy is? Because I mean, to any country, defense policies are basically secret. But in most Western countries, we have documents. So the policy being written out and then shared on a website somewhere or in an archive. You can find back quite a few years back, right? In different archives, digital and analog archives. This is not the case with Iran. So how do you figure out the foreign policy? How do you figure out the defense policy? Now, if you go again, then to the Constitution, it's my go-to. Because what you do is, as a researcher, you read the Constitution, you analyze the Constitution, and then you look at action. Okay, so does the Constitution and the actions taken align? And in the case of Iran, they do, right? So, and then there's a couple of fundamentals that we need to know about that has to do with Islam, okay? So I'm not going to go in very big detail because it's going to get boring, but we're going to take some examples. So I'm going to use some examples for you so that you can understand sort of the basic line of actions when it comes to how Iran carries out its defense policy. And by that, we can tell what the defense policy is. So I'm going to start with the 12-day war in June this year, so 2025, that I mentioned before. And the 12-day war, the first thing to say is that it's not a 12-day war because it's not over, okay? When the US says that, oh, but there's a ceasefire, no, ceasefires are negotiated, okay? So there's no ceasefire. There's been no negotiations. What happened was that Israel stopped returning fire. Now, this is an important point, okay? Why is that important? Because Iran's defense policy or posture seems to be based on non-offensive defense. So non-offensive defense is actually a posture that has been discussed in peace research. I think the last I saw of it by peace researchers was mid-1990s, a Danish research group that got some money to do some research on that. The critique against the NOD, so the non-offensive defense, is that any weapon can be used offensively, so what's the point? Now, the point is that a non-offensive defense posture means that your posture is that you will not use your weapons to attack someone. You will only use your weaponry to defend yourself against an attacker. So this so-called 12-day war ended because Israel did not return fire. Had they returned fire, Iran would have continued. Okay, so who started this war, or this part of the war? That was Israel, because Israel fired on Iran, and in that case, Iran cannot choose. If you look again at the constitution, Iran does not have a choice. It has to retaliate. And that's what Iran did. So every time they received fire from Israel, they would retaliate. And they would, what is more, retaliate in kind. So Israel, this is an example, okay? So Israel, in the first hours of their attack on Iran, they went for heads, so decapitation. It's called a decapitation. It's discussed as a decapitation strike, even though they also did some bombings of different sites. I'm going to come back to those sites. Now, when Israel staged this attack, they had groups inside Iran, so mercenaries inside Iran, or assets inside Iran, that would take out, so kill scientists, nuclear scientists, and top generals. Now they were somewhere between 60 and 70, almost all of the military personnel, so the top people, top brass that they took out, okay, but quite a few people. So scientists and military personnel. Now, in one of the retaliatory strikes that Iran did on Israel, they took out the Weizmann Institute. The Weizmann Institute is directly connected to Israel's military industry, and were involved also in research that had to do with the occupation of the West Bank, of Jerusalem, of Gaza. Okay, so when the Weizmann Institute was attacked, it was not a matter of attacking a civilian research institute. It was directly connected to Israeli military interests. Okay, so we have two things now. Iran does not attack, and Iran will retaliate in kind. Okay, if you take out airplanes, so you go for airstrips, for instance, they will do that. They will go for anything that you target. Now we're coming to a third principle, okay, that guides Iran's defense policy and military and strategic reactions. So there is a very strict prohibition on killing civilians in war. Okay, so what does that mean? Okay, we need to do sort of a small loop here, because since the Second World War, so the second Great European War, the second of them, so 1940 to 45, 39 to 45, it has been much more safe to be a military than to be a civilian. Okay, so almost 90% of people killed in war since then has been civilian. 90%. Okay. Iran has a principle that you cannot target civilians. Now, one of the reasons why we have 90% civilian deaths, so 10%, roughly speaking, 10% of the of deaths in war until now, from 1945, has been military. So 10% military, 90% civilian, right? So Iran has this prohibition on civilians. So first of all, you can of course not target civilians anymore. As an absolute prohibition on that. Ideally, you should also not happen to kill civilians. You have a great responsibility as in your retaliation of an attack to make sure as well as you can that there are no civilians where you are aiming. This becomes really, really difficult when defense batteries, for instance, are placed inside cities, or where weapon systems are actually amidst civilian areas. This means that Iran has had to develop weaponry which is extremely precise. And I remember when Iran first started to talk about this, sort of demonstrating. So this is a thing. Iran will demonstrate weapon systems that they have developed, and in the West, everybody laughs. Okay, but that's just a papier mâché missile. I mean, they haven't done anything. They're just making this up. Now, they had indicated that they had been developing high precision, and we're speaking very high precision missiles, and nobody believed it here. Then we had the assassination of Qasem Soleimani and al-Muhandis at the Baghdad airport in 2020. And Iran said, we are going to respond to this. There's going to be a retaliation. We're going to hit this particular base, and we're going to hit these buildings. And people took precautions, and most did, and at the bases, and they were huddling. So the soldiers were huddling in shelters. The shocking result of that was that Iran hit exactly what they said that they would hit. And this level of precision was until then unknown in modern warfare. When we saw the True Promise 1 and True Promise 2 and True Promise 3, we had the same results. They would hit very exactly places that were military or in cooperation with military interests in Israel. Now, there is an international prohibition on hitting or targeting nuclear facilities. The reason, of course, is you don't want to do that because you'll get leakages. And we don't want that because that will destroy the immediate area around these facilities, and it will be devastating for the populations living in that region. So there is an international prohibition on targeting such facilities. The US did that during the 12-day war. Israel did that during the 12-day war. Now, I just said that Iran retaliates in kind. In this case, they didn't. This brings us to the issue of nuclear power and the JCPOA. So, the nuclear agreement that was put in place to make sure that Iran did not um, get to a situation where they could produce a nuclear weapon. There's a whole discussion around this that I'm not going to take that has to do with the International Atomic Energy Agency, and that has to do with civilian use of nuclear energy and how that is linked to weapons production. There's a whole issue around that, and it's really quite important, but I'm not going to do that here. What I am going to bring up, because it has so directly to do with Iran's defense posture, is that Iran has claimed since it became a question that they would never develop a nuclear weapon. Do we believe that in the West? No, we don't. There are reasons why we don't believe that, and those reasons have to do with us ourselves. Okay, it doesn't have to do with Iran. It has to do with who we are and how we do things. So, if we look at this from an Iranian perspective rather than our own Western perspective, it was easy for Iran to agree to not develop a nuclear weapon because they have no intention of developing a nuclear weapon. Why do I say that with such sort of obviousness? Again, go back to the Constitution, but also to the fundamental principle of not harming civilians in war. So these two. So we have the Constitution that says that you cannot attack anyone. If you're at war, you have to make sure that you actually hit and target those who are implicated in that war. So the civilian population is not implicated in a war, right? So you'll have to respond and retaliate militarily on military facilities and on armies, and so you can't target civilian resources or civilian buildings. Everything you are allowed to target has to be directly involved in different ways in the war itself, or making the war possible, or developing weaponry. So, if you get a perfect hit on a nuclear facility, you're doomed to destroy civilian life. It's not possible not to. And you'll do it over years, decades, centuries. You're simply not allowed to do that. You are not God, okay? You're not allowed to do that. You're allowed to defend yourself, but you're not allowed to destroy life, civilian life, to destroy nature for such long stretches of time. You're just not allowed to do it. So this gives us a clue as to why Iran, as an Islamic republic, would never develop atomic weapons. Why they would never ask Pakistan to use their atomic weapons for Iran. Because from an Iranian perspective, it is deeply, deeply un-Islamic to do so. Okay, so let us pull all of these bits and pieces together so that you can get a small framework that you can use when Iran comes up in the media, and you can make some predictions. You can test my model and use it to make predictions. Okay, so just let me get some water and we'll go. Okay, so we talked about the economic policy. So the aim, the objective of the Islamic Republic is to reach a point where they have developed so far that they can support their population. So let's have a look first back at economic policy. So in Iran, the focus is on developing the economy so that the population is secured economically speaking. So in terms of welfare. So I think from my perspective as a Scandinavian, I think I recognize a lot of it. So the idea of the welfare state, I think, is central to Iran. And to be able to do this in a way that guarantees a population or their population the right to also develop as they would if they were not oppressed in any way, culturally, religiously, economically, politically, by any state from outside, as Iran has experienced. Iran has an experience which is more than 100 years of foreign interests that have limited and affected Iran's own possibilities to develop its own trajectory. And the economic policy is part of returning to a situation where Iran decides, and Iranians in Iran decides what Iran is about, okay, culturally, religiously, economically, politically. This project is part of a bigger project. It's part of a global project of decolonization. And this affects the foreign policy of Iran. So Iran will always, always go for negotiations. Even in the middle of a war, they will say, okay, we open negotiations. If they believe that there is any chance of reaching a diplomatic solution down the line to end the conflict. So Iran will go very far in terms of negotiating, even as they're involved in an open conflict or a latent conflict. A lot of people have spoken about that Iran was attacked by the US while it was negotiating with the US, and that they should have been prepared for this. My guess is they were prepared for this. I think a lot of the actions taken by Iran and the responses to questions that decision makers has come up with or have given after the fact point in that direction. They were prepared for an attack. But you, as a principle, will always negotiate with the other side if you think that will result in a peaceful solution. If you don't expect there to be any real will for a peaceful resolution, Iran will often not continue negotiations. And that is what has happened after the American response in June, and after the whole catastrophic, really, for the West reimposition of sanctions. So we don't have a snapback because snapback depends on other things, legally speaking. But Western countries have reimpositioned the UN sanctions. Other countries haven't, but the West has. And it's detrimental to the West, not to Iran, really, because Iran already got out of that and have proven that they keep their agreements, okay? The West doesn't keep its agreements. Whether they be signed or not signed, they don't stick to their agreements. Iran does, okay? So this is a win for Iran, really, in the long term. So Iran will negotiate even as it is involved in war. If Iran thinks it's possible to reach a negotiated resolution, Iran will stick to its agreements until there's a complete dead end and others have left ship. They will not break an agreement. Others might break, but they will not. So for you to recognize what Iran is doing, this is important. Now, when it comes to defense and war, Iran will not attack. So when you have in the media that there's a risk of an Iranian attack, you can rest assured that it's not going to happen. Iran will retaliate, and they will do so extremely effectively and deadly. It's lethal. Their responses, their retaliations are lethal, okay? But they will not target and often will go very far to avoid civilian casualties. Iran will never develop a nuclear weapon simply because it is fundamentally against the Islamic principles that the Constitution is framed around, and which gives the context and the basis and the fundamentals of Iran's foreign policy and defense policy. You are not allowed to play God. I know that in a Western perspective, this sounds a bit odd, but from an Iranian perspective, it's obvious, okay? So for you to recognize and be able to sort of rest a little bit more easily when there's a lot of talk about Iran and war and the Middle East, what I call the West Asia region, there are certain things that you now know about Iran that will help you be able to predict Iranian behavior, and to do that much better than the experts in mainstream media, and even better than many of the analysts on independent media.